Imagine fighting, bleeding, and watching your brothers die for a piece of dirt that has absolutely zero strategic value. Not a major crossroad, not an industrial hub, not a capital city, and not even a decent staging ground for a broader offensive. Just a miserable, barren, mud-soaked mound of earth in the middle of nowhere. That was Hill 255, better known to the men who fought and died on it as Porkchop Hill. While politicians and diplomats sat in heated tents at Panmunjom, arguing over the shape of the negotiating table and the exact wording of a ceasefire, American infantrymen were being systematically fed into a localized meat grinder just to prove a political point. We are going to break down the brutal, uncompromising reality of this forgotten nightmare. If you want to understand the raw mechanics of warfare and the cold calculus of military history, hit that subscribe button, join the community, and let me know in the comments which forgotten battle we should analyze next. To understand the slaughter at Porkchop Hill, you have to understand the strategic paralysis that gripped the Korean peninsula in the spring of 1953. The days of sweeping grand maneuvers were long gone. There were no more daring amphibious landings like Incheon, and no more massive, desperate fighting withdrawals like the Chosin Reservoir. The war had devolved into a grinding, static nightmare that looked a lot more like the trench warfare of the Western Front in 1916 than the highly mobile, mechanized combat the United States military had perfected during the Second World War. By 1953, the front line had stabilized, roughly along the 38th parallel. Both the United Nations forces and the Chinese Communist forces had dug into the rugged, mountainous terrain, creating impenetrable defensive belts consisting of bunkers, deep trenches, and tens of thousands of miles of concertina wire. It was the siege of Petersburg from the American Civil War, scaled up to a national level, but with heavy artillery, jet fighters, and automatic weapons. The political situation was equally gridlocked. In Washington, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the former Supreme Allied Commander, had just taken office with a mandate to end the Korean War. In Moscow, the geopolitical earth had shattered in March 1953 when Joseph Stalin died, throwing the Soviet leadership into a chaotic succession crisis. In Beijing, Mao Zedong saw an opportunity. The Chinese leadership understood that they could not push the Americans off the peninsula militarily, but they believed they could bleed the American public's will to fight. The peace talks at Panmunjom were stalled over the issue of prisoner of war repatriation. The United Nations refused to force Chinese and North Korean prisoners to return home against their will, a stance that infuriated the communist bloc. To gain leverage at the negotiating table, the Chinese strategy was simple but ruthless. They would launch localized, highly concentrated attacks on isolated United Nations outposts. The goal was not to break the main line, but to inflict maximum American casualties, generating negative headlines back in the States, and forcing the US negotiators to concede. This brings us to the tactical layout of the battlefield, and the concept of the outpost line of resistance. The main defensive belt for the US 8th Army was known as the Main Line of Resistance, or the MLR. To protect the MLR from surprise attacks, the US military established a series of heavily fortified outposts on the hills, sitting a few thousand yards in front of the main line. These outposts had names like Old Baldy, T-Bone, Arsenal, and Porkchop. Hill 255 earned the name Porkchop Hill because of its topographical shape when viewed on a contour map. It was a modest elevation, rising roughly 300 meters, or about 1,000 feet above the surrounding valley floor. It was located in the Iron Triangle sector, a notoriously violent stretch of terrain. Why defend it? If the hill had no strategic value, why not just abandon it and pull the men back to the safety of the MLR? This is a question that military academies still debate today. The tactical justification was line of sight. If the Chinese took Porkchop Hill, they would have a clear, unobstructed view directly down into the American MLR, allowing their forward observers to call in devastatingly accurate artillery fire on US supply routes and troop concentrations. But there was a darker, more cynical reason. The High Command believed that abandoning any ground, no matter how insignificant, would show weakness to the Chinese negotiators at Panmunjom. It was a war of optics, paid for in blood. Let us look at the forces tasked with holding this miserable piece of real estate. The defense of the sector fell to the US 7th Infantry Division, known as the Hourglass Division. This was a battle-hardened unit with a brutal combat pedigree. They had fought in the freezing Aleutian Islands at Attu during World War II, waded ashore at Leyte, landed at Incheon, and survived the frozen hell of the Chosin Reservoir. By the spring of 1953, the division was commanded by Major General Arthur G. Trudeau. Trudeau was an engineer by trade, a brilliant, aggressive officer who demanded strict discipline and aggressive patrolling from his men. Under his command was the 31st Infantry Regiment, led by Colonel William Kern, which would bear the brunt of the initial fighting on Porkchop Hill. The American infantryman on Porkchop Hill in 1953 was equipped with the standard tools of the mid-20th century US military. The primary weapon was the M1 Garand rifle. Firing the heavy, hard-hitting .30-06 Springfield cartridge, the Garand was a masterpiece of engineering. It weighed about 9.5 pounds and fed from an 8-round en-bloc clip. In the open field, its range and stopping power were unmatched, but in the claustrophobic, zigzagging trenches and dark bunkers of Porkchop Hill, its 43-inch length made it cumbersome. Close-quarters combat in the trenches was often handled by men carrying the M1 carbine, which was lighter and held a 15-round or 30-round magazine, though it lacked stopping power. The real backbone of the infantry squad was the Browning automatic rifle, or BAR. Weighing in at nearly 20 pounds loaded, the BAR provided the squad with its base of fire, spitting out .30-06 rounds from a 20-round box magazine. However, the true American advantage was not in small arms, but in the god of war: artillery. The US military doctrine relied heavily on overwhelming, mathematically precise artillery support. The 7th Infantry Division was backed by battalions of 105mm and 155mm howitzers. The American artillerymen had perfected a terrifying tactic known as time on target, or TOT. In a TOT mission, multiple artillery batteries located at different distances from the target would calculate the exact flight time of their shells. They would then coordinate their firing times so that every single shell from every single gun would impact the target area at the exact same fraction of a second. The result was instantaneous, apocalyptic destruction with zero warning. There was no whistling sound, no time to dive into a bunker, just a sudden, earth-shattering wall of steel and high explosives. Facing the Americans was the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, specifically elements of the 23rd Army, including the 67th and 141st Divisions. Do not make the mistake of underestimating the Chinese military of 1953. The stereotype of mindless human wave attacks is a vast oversimplification and, frankly, historically inaccurate. By this stage of the war, the Chinese had evolved into a highly sophisticated, incredibly disciplined light infantry force. They lacked the mechanized logistics of the Americans. They did not have fleets of 2.5-ton trucks or transport helicopters. Instead, their logistics relied on human muscle. Thousands of porters moved supplies forward under the cover of darkness, carrying 50 to 80 pounds of ammunition and rations on A-frames strapped to their backs. The Chinese doctrine was built around infiltration and the short attack. They were masters of camouflage and night movement. They would spend days slowly crawling forward, cutting American concertina wire strand by strand, clearing minefields by hand, and hiding in the brush until they were within grenade-throwing distance of the US trenches. Their primary close-quarters weapon was the PPSH-41 submachine gun, known to the Americans as the Burp gun, because of its incredibly high rate of fire. Firing a 7.62 by 25mm pistol cartridge at roughly 900 rounds per minute from a 71-round drum magazine, the Burp gun was devastating in trench-clearing operations. In a 10-yard knife fight inside a muddy trench, the man with the Burp gun had a distinct advantage over the man with a bolt-action or semi-automatic rifle. Furthermore, the Chinese relied heavily on hand grenades, specifically stick grenades, which they would throw in massive volleys right before charging into the American positions. The Chinese had also vastly improved their own artillery capabilities by 1953. They were no longer just relying on light mortars. They had brought up heavily camouflaged 122mm Soviet-supplied howitzers and 120mm heavy mortars, zeroed in perfectly on the American outposts. They had also constructed what they called the Underground Great Wall. The Chinese had dug massive tunnel networks deep into the reverse slopes of their hills, immune to American airstrikes and artillery. They could mass thousands of troops underground, completely invisible to US aerial reconnaissance, and then unleash them in a sudden, overwhelming night assault. The environment itself was an active enemy. April in Korea is a miserable time of year. The freezing winter temperatures begin to break, turning the frozen earth into a thick, soupy, knee-deep mud. The trenches on Pork Chop Hill were constantly collapsing. Sandbags rotted. The men were soaked, exhausted, and covered in filth. Supplying the outpost was a logistical nightmare. Every bullet, every sea ration, every drop of water, and every roll of barbed wire had to be carried up the 300-meter slope by hand, often under sniper and mortar fire. The US military frequently employed Korean civilian laborers, known as the chigga bearers, to haul these supplies up the steep ridges. The stage was set for a collision of two completely different military philosophies. On one side, the American reliance on firepower, heavy logistics, and static defense. On the other, the Chinese mastery of stealth, night infiltration, and close-quarters shock tactics. The American garrison on Pork Chop Hill consisted of a reinforced company of infantry, heavily dug in, surrounded by minefields, trip flares, and thousands of yards of barbed wire. They knew the Chinese were out there in the dark. The intelligence reports had been indicating a buildup of enemy forces in the sector for weeks. The tension on the line was palpable, a tightly coiled spring waiting to snap. As the sun set on the evening of April 16, 1953, the temperature dropped, and a cold darkness settled over the Iron Triangle. In their bunkers, American infantrymen cleaned their weapons, checked their ammunition, and stared out into the black void of no man's land. Less than a mile away, deep within their subterranean staging areas, thousands of Chinese assault troops were quietly moving into position, their weapons loaded, their bayonets fixed. The artillery spotters on both sides had their coordinates locked in. The politicians in Panmunjom were asleep in their comfortable beds. The men on Hill 255 were about to find out exactly how much their lives were worth to the men drawing lines on a map. At exactly 2300 hours on the night of April 16, 1953, the silence over the Iron Triangle was shattered by the deafening roar of Chinese artillery. The sky to the north illuminated with a strobing, violent orange glow as elements of the Chinese 23rd Army unleashed a meticulously coordinated bombardment directly onto the crest of Porkchop Hill. This was not random harassing fire. This was a calculated, concentrated saturation barrage designed to pulverize the American defensive works before a single Chinese infantryman stepped into the barbed wire. The Communist forces utilized Soviet-supplied 122mm howitzers and 120mm heavy mortars, weapons perfectly suited for this specific type of mountain warfare. The 120mm mortar in particular was a devastating tool, firing a massive 35-pound high-explosive projectile in a high looping trajectory. The mortar rounds dropped almost vertically onto the American positions. This plunging fire negated the frontal protection of the US sandbagged bunkers. The shells did not hit the thick forward walls. They crashed straight down through the roof timbers, detonating inside the confined spaces of the fighting positions, instantly vaporizing the occupants and collapsing the heavy earthen roofs down onto the trench lines. How do you maintain a cohesive defensive line when the very ground beneath your boots is boiling with high explosives? The brutal truth is, you do not. You press your face into the mud, you cover the back of your neck with your hands, and you pray that the next 35-pound shell lands 10 yards to your left instead of directly on your helmet. The physical concussions from a barrage of this density do terrible things to the human body. The shock waves rupture eardrums, cause severe internal bleeding, and induce a state of profound psychological shock that leaves men completely incapacitated. The American garrison, consisting primarily of King Company of the 31st Infantry Regiment, was pinned to the floor of their trenches, their communication lines instantly severed. Telephone wires strung along the surface were shredded into useless copper spaghetti by the shrapnel, isolating the platoons from their command posts and cutting off the vital link to the American artillery batteries sitting miles to the rear. Under the cover of this apocalyptic bombardment, 2 full companies of Chinese infantry from the 251st Regiment began their assault. They had already bypassed the outer trip flares and were crawling through the blasted gaps in the concertina wire. The Chinese tactical execution was flawless. They crept up the steep, muddy slopes in total darkness, completely undetected, until they were literally staring down into the American trenches. When the Chinese artillery abruptly lifted at 23:30 hours, the infantry swarmed over the parapets. The combat instantly devolved from a long-range artillery duel into a claustrophobic, prehistoric nightmare of hand-to-hand slaughter. This was not the sweeping, mechanized warfare of the European theater in World War II. This was the Battle of the Crater from the American Civil War, reborn in the freezing mud of Korea. Men were trapped in a dark, narrow ditch, slipping on blood and empty brass, stabbing, gouging, and beating each other to death with entrenching tools, rifle butts, and bare hands. The primary weapons of this trench fight were not rifles, but hand grenades. The geometry of a trench system is specifically designed in a zigzag pattern to prevent the blast wave of an explosive or the enfilading fire of a machine gun from traveling straight down the line. To clear these corners, the Chinese relied on the Type 67 stick grenade. It was a simple, rudimentary weapon, essentially a cast iron fragmentation sleeve mounted on a wooden handle. The handle provided excellent leverage, allowing the Chinese assault troops to hurl the grenades at incredible distances and with pinpoint accuracy. They threw them in massive synchronized volleys, creating a rolling wall of explosions that cleared the zigzag corners just seconds before the Burp gunners rushed in. The Americans countered with the Mark II fragmentation grenade, the classic pineapple grenade. Weighing 21 ounces and filled with TNT, the Mark II produced a lethal blast radius of about 10 yards. In the 5-foot-wide confines of a trench, the overpressure and high-velocity cast-iron shrapnel from a Mark II detonation were absolutely devastating. The fight for Porkchop Hill became a brutal game of geometry and timing, bouncing fragmentation grenades off the dirt walls of the trench corners and hoping the 5-second fuse burned down before the enemy could kick it back. By midnight, King Company was fighting for its very survival. The Chinese had successfully occupied the main trench line on the crest of the hill, splitting the American defenders into isolated, desperate pockets of resistance. Platoon leaders were dead, squad cohesion was completely shattered, and ammunition was running dangerously low. The M1 carbines, heavily favored by officers and radiomen for their light weight, began to jam relentlessly as the fine Korean mud caved into the receivers. Men were forced to strip weapons and ammunition from the bodies of their dead friends just to keep firing. In a desperate bid to prevent the entire hill from being overrun, the American commanders made the ultimate, agonizing tactical decision. They called for artillery fire directly on their own positions. Would you have the nerve to pick up a radio handset and call for a 155mm artillery strike directly on the coordinates of the bunker you are currently sitting in? That was the cold, mathematical reality of the outpost line of resistance. The U.S. 8th Army artillery batteries miles away received the fire mission and immediately loaded their howitzers with variable time or VT proximity fuses. This was a piece of technology that gave the Americans a massive lethal advantage. The VT fuse contained a miniature Doppler radar transmitter and receiver. As the artillery shell plummeted toward the earth, the radar would bounce radio waves off the ground. When the shell reached a preset altitude, usually about 50 feet in the air, the fuse detonated the high explosive charge. This created a devastating airburst, showering the exposed Chinese infantry on the surface of the hill with thousands of razor-sharp, high-velocity steel fragments. The Americans, hunkered down deep inside their reinforced bunkers with overhead cover, were relatively safe from the downward blast. The Chinese, caught in the open trenches and on the exposed slopes, were slaughtered by the hundreds. The airbursts turned the night sky into a terrifying canopy of lethal steel rain. But even this staggering display of firepower was not enough to dislodge the Chinese, who had already penetrated the deep bunkers. By dawn on April 17th, the situation on Hill 255 was critical. The Chinese held the crest and the majority of the trench network. The remnants of King Company were trapped in a few isolated bunkers on the reverse slope, fighting off continuous grenade attacks. The commanders of the 7th Infantry Division knew they had to launch an immediate counterattack before the Chinese could consolidate their gains and turn the American bunkers against them. The task fell to Love Company of the 31st Infantry Regiment, commanded by First Lieutenant Joseph Clemens. Clemens was a pragmatic, battle-hardened officer who understood exactly what he was being asked to do. He was being ordered to march his men up a 300-meter, 45-degree slope through knee-deep mud directly into the teeth of heavy machine gun fire, to retake a shattered trench line filled with an unknown number of enemy troops. It was the American assault up the volcanic ash slopes of Iwo Jima all over again, but stripped of the massive naval gunfire support and fought in the freezing, miserable terrain of the Korean peninsula. At 0430 hours, Love Company began its grueling ascent. The moment they crossed the line of departure, they were subjected to a withering barrage of Chinese mortar fire and interlocking heavy machine gun fire from the adjacent hills. The Chinese had perfectly dialed in the avenues of approach. To dig the deeply entrenched communist fighters out of the reinforced bunkers, the Americans had to rely on one of the most terrifying weapons in the infantry arsenal, the M2A1 portable flamethrower. The M2A1 was a brutal, heavy, and highly dangerous piece of equipment. Fully loaded, it weighed 72 pounds. The operator had to strap 2 large tanks of thickened, napalm-like fuel to his back, along with a smaller spherical tank containing pressurized nitrogen propellant. The weapon fired a stream of ignited fuel that could reach up to 40 yards, but the operator only had about 8 seconds of continuous fire before the tanks ran dry. To use it effectively, the flamethrower operator had to expose himself to enemy fire, walking upright into close range of the bunker aperture. He was a slow, heavy, highly visible target, and the life expectancy of a flamethrower operator on Porkchop Hill was measured in minutes. But the tactical effect of the weapon was undeniable. When the ignited napalm shot through the narrow firing slit of a bunker, it did not just burn the occupants to death. The intense, rapid combustion instantly consumed all the oxygen in the confined space, suffocating anyone who managed to avoid the flames. The psychological terror of the flamethrower was absolute. Even the most hardened, disciplined Chinese infantrymen would break and run when they saw the thick black smoke and the roaring jet of orange liquid fire washing over their positions. Throughout the morning of April 17th, Lieutenant Clemens and Love Company fought a grinding, yard-by-yard battle of attrition. It was a methodical, bloody process of bunker clearing. A squad would lay down a base of suppressive fire with their Browning automatic rifles. A designated man would low-crawl through the mud to flank the bunker, hurling a white phosphorus grenade into the aperture to blind the defenders. Then, the flamethrower operator would step up, unleash a burst of liquid fire, and the rifleman would rush in to finish the job with bayonets and point-blank Garand fire. By 0800 hours, Love Company had suffered over 50% casualties. The dead and wounded were stacked in the muddy communication trenches, severely hindering the movement of the surviving men. The logistics of sustaining this counterattack were collapsing. The steep, muddy trails leading up the rear of the hill were completely zeroed in by Chinese artillery. Every squad of American reinforcements, every case of .30 caliber ammunition, and every stretcher bearing a wounded soldier had to run a gauntlet of high explosives. The Korean Chige bearers, displaying immense bravery, continued to haul 80-pound loads of ammunition up the slope, but they were taking heavy losses. The mud was so thick that the wounded had to be tied to their stretchers to prevent them from sliding off as they were carried down the treacherous incline. Blood mixed with the freezing rain and the pulverized dirt, turning the entire hill into a slick, red abattoir. By mid-afternoon, Lieutenant Clemens realized his company was bleeding to death. He had successfully recaptured a portion of the main trench line, but he did not have enough able-bodied men left to hold it against the inevitable Chinese counterattack that would come as soon as the sun went down. The Chinese had a seemingly endless supply of reinforcements massing in the valley below, utilizing their underground Great Wall to move troops into assault positions completely shielded from American airstrikes. Clemens desperately radioed battalion command, demanding reinforcements, water, and immediate medical evacuation for his dozens of critically wounded men. The radio crackled with static, the distant voices of the High Command trying to assess a tactical situation that had spiraled completely out of control. The commanders at division headquarters were now faced with a grim calculus. How many more American lives were they willing to feed into the meat grinder of Hill 255 just to maintain a bargaining chip at the peace talks? The sun was beginning to drop behind the jagged peaks of the Iron Triangle, casting long, cold shadows over the shattered trenches, and the men of Love Company knew that the true horror of Porkchop Hill was only just beginning. As the last light of April 17th faded from the Korean sky, the tactical reality for the remnants of Love Company was nothing short of a death sentence. The Chinese 141st Division had not spent the daylight hours sitting idle. Deep within their subterranean tunnel networks, on the reverse slopes of the adjacent hills, fresh communist assault companies were massing, completely immune to the American fighter bombers that had scoured the surface throughout the afternoon. When night fell, the American air cover had to return to base, and the U.S. infantrymen on Porkchop Hill were once again left alone in the dark. At 21:30 hours, the Chinese artillery opened up again, signaling the start of the second major night offensive. This time, the American High Command at the 7th Infantry Division headquarters did not hesitate. They immediately committed their reserves, throwing Easy and Fox companies of the 31st Infantry Regiment directly into the meat grinder. The reinforcement of Hill 255, under the cover of darkness, was a logistical and tactical nightmare. American troops had to navigate up the steep, pulverized rear slopes of the hill, while under constant plunging mortar fire. To hold the shattered trench lines, the arriving U.S. infantry relied heavily on the M1919A4 Browning machine gun. This weapon was the absolute anchor of the American infantry defense. Firing the same .30-06 cartridge as the M1 Garand, the M1919 was an air-cooled, belt-fed workhorse that weighed just over 31 pounds. It was fed from 250-round cloth belts, and in the hands of a trained crew, it could lay down a devastating base of interlocking fire. But operating the M1919 under the extreme stress of a night assault required cold, mechanical precision. The weapon fired from a closed bolt, meaning it was prone to overheating and cooking off rounds if fired too rapidly for too long. More importantly, the gunner had to manually set the headspace and timing of the weapon every time the barrel was changed. If you miscalculated the headspace by a fraction of an inch in the freezing, mud-slicked darkness, the gun would either jam completely or violently explode in your face, taking your eyes and fingers with it. The men of Easy and Fox companies wrestled with these heavy weapons, dragging them through the collapsed trenches, setting them up on the pulverized parapets, and firing blindly into the screaming waves of Chinese infantry, illuminated only by the ghostly, flickering light of parachute flares. Does fighting and dying for a heavily fortified, isolated position, only to abandon it later, sound familiar to you? It should, because the United States military would repeat this exact same strategic disconnect 16 years later in the jungles of Vietnam. If you look at the Battle of Hamburger Hill in the A Shau Valley in 1969, you see the exact same blueprint of futility. In both cases, American airborne and infantry units were ordered to assault a steep, heavily defended elevation that possessed absolutely no long-term strategic value. In both cases, the enemy used the terrain to bleed the Americans, maximizing U.S. casualties to score a political victory back in Washington. And in both cases, shortly after securing the blood-soaked dirt at a horrific cost, the US military simply packed up and walked away, leaving the surviving veterans to wonder what their brothers had actually died for. The tactical victory on the ground meant absolutely nothing if the strategic objective was flawed from the start. To truly understand the scale of the violence on Porkchop Hill, we have to pull back and look at the multi-dimensional mechanics of the battle, starting with the sheer, mind-boggling logistics of American artillery. During the multi-day struggle for Hill 255, the artillery battalions of the US 7th Infantry Division fired over 100,000 rounds of 105mm and 155mm ammunition. Let that number sink in for a moment. 100,000 heavy artillery shells dropped onto an area of operations barely larger than a few football fields. Think about the economic and logistical tail required to make that happen. An American 105mm high-explosive shell weighed roughly 33 pounds. That shell had to be manufactured in a steel mill in Pennsylvania or Ohio, packed with explosives in a dedicated munitions plant, loaded onto a rail car, and shipped to a naval port on the West Coast. From there, it was loaded into the cargo hold of a transport ship for a multi-week voyage across the Pacific Ocean to the port of Busan in South Korea. It was then loaded onto another train, moved north to a supply dump, transferred onto a 2.5-ton truck, driven over treacherous dirt mountain roads to a forward artillery battery, and finally slammed into the breech of a howitzer by an exhausted artilleryman. The United States military-industrial complex was moving millions of pounds of steel and high explosives halfway across the planet just to churn the mud on one insignificant Korean ridgeline. Contrast this mechanized logistical leviathan with the Chinese approach. The Chinese military economy in 1953 was largely agrarian and technologically inferior, but they possessed an overwhelming abundance of manpower and a ruthless willingness to expend it. The United States Air Force had been conducting Operation Strangle, a massive aerial interdiction campaign designed to destroy Chinese supply lines, bomb their bridges, and strafe their truck convoys. To counter this, the Chinese simply bypassed the roads. They moved their supplies on the backs of hundreds of thousands of human porters. A Chinese laborer would strap 80 pounds of millet, mortar shells, and stick grenades to a wooden A-frame on his back and march hundreds of miles south through the mountains, traveling only at night to avoid American aircraft. The Chinese traded human sweat and blood for the mechanical efficiency they lacked. This created a strategic stalemate that the Americans struggled to comprehend. You cannot bomb a supply line that consists of 1 million men walking through the woods in the dark. From an intelligence perspective, the Battle of Porkchop Hill represents a fascinating failure of tactical anticipation, despite overwhelming strategic awareness. The American signals intelligence and aerial reconnaissance networks knew the Chinese were massing in the Iron Triangle. They knew an attack was imminent. But the rigid nature of the outpost line of resistance doctrine forced the Americans to play a purely reactive game. By placing isolated company-sized elements on forward hills, the US command handed the initiative entirely to the Chinese. The enemy got to decide exactly when, where, and with how many men the battle would begin. The American outposts were essentially heavily armed tripwires designed to absorb the initial shock of an assault and then rely on pre-planned artillery fire to survive. But as we saw on the night of April 16th, artillery alone cannot hold ground. When the enemy is willing to absorb horrific losses to close the distance and get inside your trenches, the battle ultimately comes down to the infantryman and his rifle. The political dimension of this battle is perhaps the most cynical and infuriating aspect for the military analyst. While the men on Porkchop Hill were gouging each other's eyes out in the mud, the peace negotiators at Panmunjom were sitting in heated tents, drinking coffee and arguing over the repatriation of prisoners of war. The Chinese leadership, directed by Mao Zedong, understood the American political center of gravity perfectly. They knew they could not march down the peninsula and capture Seoul again. The UN defensive lines were simply too strong. But they also knew that the American public was growing incredibly weary of a war that seemed to have no end and no clear objective. The Chinese strategy was to inflict maximum casualties on American forces in highly publicized, localized battles. They wanted the casualty lists printed in the New York Times and the Washington Post to grow longer every single day. They were weaponizing American democracy against the US military. The US High Command, in turn, felt they could not abandon Porkchop Hill because it would signal a lack of resolve to the communist negotiators. The lives of the men in the 31st Infantry Regiment were literally being used as poker chips in a geopolitical card game. This brutal calculus is not unique to the Korean War. If you look back at the American Civil War, specifically the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse in 1864, you see the exact same horrific dynamic at the bloody angle. Union and Confederate soldiers fought continuously for 20 hours in a torrential downpour, firing blindly into the mud, stabbing each other over a useless line of log breastworks. The trenches filled with water and blood, and men were trampled to death in the muck by their own comrades. The generals on both sides kept feeding regiments into the slaughter, not because the ground was strategically vital, but because neither side could afford the psychological blow of retreating. Porkchop Hill was the bloody angle of the Cold War, fought with flamethrowers and proximity-fused artillery instead of muskets and bayonets. By the morning of April 18th, the American counterattacks had finally managed to push the surviving Chinese infantry off the crest of Hill 255. The 7th Infantry Division had secured the outpost, but the cost was staggering. The trenches were completely destroyed, the bunkers were collapsed, and the hill itself had been reduced to a pulverized lunar landscape of craters and shattered weapons. The bodies of American and Chinese soldiers were layered on top of each other, buried in the mud, and torn apart by the relentless artillery fire. The tactical victory belonged to the United States, but it was a hollow, bitter triumph. The ultimate tragedy of Porkchop Hill occurred just a few months later. In July of 1953, the Chinese launched another massive, division-sized assault on the exact same position. Once again, the artillery rained down, and once again, American infantrymen were sent up the slopes to bleed for the dirt. But this time, General Maxwell Taylor, the commander of the 8th Army, looked at the casualty reports and made a cold, rational military decision. He realized that the political optics were no longer worth the blood of his soldiers. He ordered the hill abandoned. The Americans pulled back to the main line of resistance, leaving Porkchop Hill to the Chinese. Less than 3 weeks later, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed, freezing the border exactly where it was. The men who fought, bled, and watched their friends die for Hill 255 had to live with the agonizing knowledge that the ground they had paid for in blood had simply been given away. War is rarely a clean, glorious endeavor fought for noble ideals on a pristine battlefield. More often than not, it is a brutal, confusing, and terrifying exercise in attrition, where the lives of brave men are expended by distant leaders fighting for leverage on a map. The Battle of Porkchop Hill remains a stark, uncomfortable reminder of the limits of firepower, the terrifying reality of night combat, and the heavy price paid by the infantrymen when strategy is dictated by political optics rather than military necessity. The dirt of Hill 255 looks just like any other dirt in Korea today, but beneath the surface, it holds the shattered steel and the silent echoes of a forgotten slaughter. Thank you for joining me in this deep dive into one of the most brutal and overlooked engagements of the Korean War. I want to hear your perspective on the strategic realities we just analyzed. Which factor do you believe was the most decisive in creating the brutal, grinding stalemate of the Korean War? A. The rugged, mountainous terrain that completely negated American mechanized and armored advantages. B. The massive, seemingly endless manpower and light infantry tactics of the Chinese military. Or C. The political restrictions from Washington that prevented the United States military from expanding the war and bombing targets inside China. Drop your answer and your reasoning in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button to support the channel and stay tuned for our next breakdown of military history.